I'm making some dollhouse miniatures using craft supplies I got from Michael's. I've seen so many people use it, but I've never owned Rub and Buff. I'll be using it to transform this extremely cheap miniature lantern. First, I'm removing this clear plastic piece and cleaning up some of these edges. I'm using flush cutters to trim plastic that leaked outside of the mold. I'm also trimming this strange yellow piece in the middle that really takes away the realism. I tried to finish by sanding, but this plastic is so cheap it was just turning furry. I cleaned off all the sanding dust with rubbing alcohol and gave it a coat of black paint. The black paint is a great base to add some Rub and Buff. I'm using gold leaf. For a little added spice, I also added a small amount of silver randomly. I've already used the gold leaf and the silver leaf, so now I'm using the third color I purchased, which is antique gold. I anticipated liking this color the most, so I bought 2 tubes of antique gold. I have a stash of strings I mostly got from price tags. I'm looking for a cotton-like piece I can use to make a faux wick. I frayed the end and colored it black so it looks charred. Coloring the end of the string does a good job achieving the effect, but I'd like a little more realism. I think the best way to simulate a charred effect is to actually char it, so I'm using a lighter to burn the end. I'm adding some glue to stiffen up this piece of string so it's easier to install in the lantern. I added a bit of white glue where the weird yellow post used to be and added my little piece of charred string. With just a couple simple steps, the world's cheapest lantern now looks pretty cute. For just a little bit of extra detail, I'm using my pin vise to make a small hole in the front of the lantern. I use this cheap magnetic mechanics dish to store my pin cutoffs to use later. I'm using this little bit of pin head to add some detail to the lantern. It's a pretty tight fit, so I just added it using white glue because I try to avoid using super glue. I scuffed up the tiny head of the pin so it's easier to paint. I'm adding Rub and Buff directly to the metal. The cheap lantern I started with hardly looked worth saving, so I think this is a big transformation. I got this ultra matte finish to seal things I don't want to have any shine, like faux stones and bricks. I'm testing it on this cheap cake from Temu. You can see how this one looks more expensive and realistic because it's matte, but the green one is really shiny and looks very cheap. This is supposed to be some kind of macaroon cake, so I'm adding the ultra matte finish to all of the green areas. This really could not have worked better because the entire cake was as shiny as the fruit on top, but now all the places I painted are nice and matte. I'm really curious how Matte ModPodge compares, so I'm doing a little test. My ModPodge bottle is in rough shape, but it's actually an old bottle I keep refilling, so the product is nice and fresh. I'm completely covering each of these cheap plastic cakes, the ModPodge on the left and Ultra Matte on the right. You can color me surprised because I think they turned out exactly the same, which is weird because whenever I use Matte ModPodge on paper, it definitely leaves a sheen. Maybe it's more matte on non-porous surfaces. I also got this triple thick glaze from DecoArt. I opened it up and compulsively scraped all the remnants off of the paper lid into the jar because I hate waste. I've always been that person to lick every bit of food off of any foil lid I've ever opened. I'll showcase this product again later, but for now I'm just using it to add some sheen to the chocolate. Everything I bought froze solid in 10-degree weather overnight, so I'm really relieved to see my triple thick glaze seems to be fine, as well as the ultra matte finish. Maybe someday I'll spruce up all these cheap cakes and use them in a miniature scene. I'm digging into my stash of miniature glass to try the ultra matte finish on a very smooth surface. This is just a little glass bottle from the Dollar Tree. I covered it with one coat of the ultra matte finish. Now that the surface has a little bit of tooth, I'm able to come in with some Rub and Buff and add metallic to the surface. You can substitute Matte ModPodge if you don't have the ultra matte. For a large item, you can also use a spray sealer that has a matte finish. I do suggest using 2 coats of the ultra matte because there were a few small streaks I missed and the Rub and Buff did not stick to those smooth areas at all. This is what you can expect if you use Rub and Buff on a smooth surface like glass without prepping it first. It creates kind of a patchy, uneven appearance, but worse than that, you can just rub it right off of the surface. On this piece I prepped with the ultra matte, it's definitely not coming off. This Dollar Tree jar is pretty boring, but I could easily add some paper handles and a lid and transform it into a milk can. It took me a couple years, but I've used most of my other mold putty, so I bought some more Amazing Mold Putty. The bottle looks different from the original, but I think the product is the same. To make a mold, you just use equal parts of part A and B. I always just eyeball it by volume, and I've never had a problem. I'm mixing the two parts until it's fully incorporated, but this does set up, so you don't want to mix it for too long. I'm rolling out the mold putty on the top of the cap using a paintbrush. I really like this little frame, so this is the piece I'm copying. My cheapo depot self did not use enough mold putty, so when I pressed the frame into the mold, it just cut all the way through. I may have not even noticed this if I hadn't made the mold on top of the clear lid. This stuff is pretty forgiving, so I just mixed up more mold putty and incorporated it into the first batch I made. To create my mold, I'm pushing the frame straight down. I want the mold to be completely in contact with the frame, so I'm pushing the edges in. I'm rolling over the top with my paintbrush and pushing the edges in once more before I let this mold set up. When the mold is set, it's still nice and flexible, but it'll hold its shape. It seems pretty similar to molds I've made in the past, so I'm assuming the formula is the same. I keep my scrap pieces of clay in a bag, so I'm just mixing up a random color to fill the frame with since I'm painting it anyway. I wish I had filmed the strange colors I used to make this beautiful green color. There was baby blue, lemon yellow, some brown, and I think even some pink. I tossed the entire mold and the polymer clay into the oven to bake for about 20 minutes at 270, but look at the instructions for your own clay. I'm using a combination of an X-Acto knife and sandpaper to clean up the edges. I added a base layer of brown acrylic paint covered with antique gold rub and buff. I traced around the frame onto an image from a magazine. I'm cutting slightly on the inside of the line I drew to make sure this image is smaller than the outer frame. I added some double-sided tape to the back of the image so I can stick it to some cereal box. I used plain white glue to attach the frame to the image and weight it down while it dried. To imitate the look of glass, I'm using more of the triple thick glaze I used earlier in the video. The original frame is a bit shinier, but I do think they look very similar. I've never read the instructions, but now I'm wondering if it's called rub and buff because there's another step after you apply it to make it shinier. I've seen Miss Mini Life use shrink plastic, so I wanted to get some of my own. This shrinks to 1/3 of its original size. This comes with 25 sheets, so I'm pretty sure I'll be using this for the rest of my life. I'll be drawing on the plastic and using my heat gun to shrink it, and we'll both see what happens. I'm making a mini stained glass window. I googled images of stained glass windows. I used the Shrinky Dinks plastic like tracing paper, placed it on my phone, and traced the image. The marker doesn't dry on the surface right away, so you can technically fix mistakes by just rubbing it away and redrawing it. I used a couple different shades of pink Sharpie to color the flower in the center. When it shrinks, the color becomes more concentrated, so I chose lighter shades. Right now it's 2 by 2 and 5/8 inches, so let's see how much it shrinks. I'm using my heat gun to shrink the plastic. I think I started out a bit too far away, so I got a little bit closer and more aggressive. The plastic very suddenly folded over itself and curled into a pretty tight ball. I tried to unroll it to flatten it, but it wasn't really working, so I just kept applying heat. It's a bit hard to see in the video, but I put the heat gun directly over top of the plastic, which helped flatten it out. I was really surprised that my crinkled ball of plastic flattened into this cute little shape, although I did leave an indent using my tweezers. I think I might try to use this in my Gryffindor common room project to make the windows. I did expect this would end up really thin and kind of flimsy, but it's actually very thick and strong. I'm wondering if I didn't heat it up enough because it didn't quite shrink to 1/3 of its original size. I also got some lightweight, spongy clay from Model Magic. Like all the rest of my products, this clay spent the night outside and froze completely solid. It warns you not to let this product freeze, so let me know if this texture looks right because I have no idea if this stuff is still good anymore. I got this transparent polymer clay from Fimo to use in the future to make some food. Consider joining my Patreon as a free member or as a paying member for $3 a month. Check out this next video to watch me make miniatures from scratch.